Hi guys, and welcome to lesson 11 of the UK's human landscape. Now, last lesson we looked at urban expansion, how a city grows, but today we're going to delve much more deeply into the regeneration of certain areas of our cities. In particular, as we have been doing throughout this unit, we are looking at our case study in Stratford in East London. And this particular case study is really interesting because it's regeneration of a large portion of the urban landscape that had formerly been sort of factories, businesses, a lot of industrial landscape that has then sort of fallen into decline, as we've discussed. And through this process of regeneration, the hope is that it will move out of this period of decline and into regeneration. The question for our lesson, however, is not just whether or not this regeneration is occurring, because it definitely is occurring, but whether or not it's always a good thing and who it's a good thing for. Who does it benefit?
So, urban regeneration. These two images here show you parts of the regenerated portions of Stratford, in particular the Olympic Park. But what we're talking about today is not just the Olympic Park, although that is a large part of it, but also the surrounding areas. Remembering that Stratford is in Newham in East London, and that this is an area with quite high levels of deprivation. So today we're going to be looking at the reasons that we regenerate urban areas, why do we bother doing this, and some of the impacts as viewed through the example of Stratford. So I want us to start off with two quotes, and I'm going to ask you to look at them separately. I'm not putting them on the same page for good reason. So we start off with this one. This is a quote written in 2016, okay? And I'm going to ask you to answer the following two questions about it. What does the quote suggest East London is like? What image does it paint in your mind? Yes, this might sound like a bit of a English task, but I really want you to think about it, because the way that we portray different areas is really key to how people actually think about them. Very often our perception of a place is created by the way it is being represented. So representation and perception are two key concepts that we keep returning to in geography, and particularly when we're talking about place and space, okay, the creation of places and their identity, we are coming from a direction of thinking about how are these places perceived. So what is the message suggested by this quote about the changes that are coming to the area? Okay. A few months beforehand, the district had been abuzz with commerce, the largest concentration of manufacturing businesses in the entire Greater London area, including printmakers, dressmakers, stonemasons, tanners, concrete crushers, and dozens more. Family-owned firms passed down through generations, as well as the local operations of national and international companies. Over 350 employers, with a combined workforce of over 12,000 skilled artisans and traders. Every single one was being erased from the landscape to make room for just over 2 weeks of sport. What this quote is talking about is the area that was cleared to create the Olympic Park in East London, and the area that would then house the new Olympic Stadium. What impression does it give you of the things that it was replacing? Because in a previous lesson, we've talked about how areas were quite derelict. We've talked about how maybe certain parts of land might be brownfield sites, areas that need redeveloping because they're no longer serving the needs of that community, and that we are better off sort of knocking down the buildings and rebuilding on. But this particular quote is very positive about the area, and actually towards the end here quite negative about the reasons for getting rid of this industry. So here's another quote, and I'm asking you the same two questions. What does it suggest East London is like? And what is the message suggested about the changes to the area? Does it view them positively or negatively? And what examples can we pick out? This quote is from the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, during the 2012 Olympics. So not post-Olympics, as we've just seen in that previous quote. Of course, the Mayor of London has changed twice since then. We've had Boris Johnson for 2 terms, and now we have Sadiq Khan. So, this quote, I didn't bid for the Olympics because I wanted 3 weeks of sport. I bid for the Olympics because it's the only way to get billions of pounds out of the government to develop the East End, to clean the soil, put in the infrastructure and build the housing. It's exactly how I plotted it, to ensnare the government to put money into an area it has neglected for 30 years. I am delighted that there will be billions of pounds from the government. So this quote, very positive about the regeneration of the area, the perception that the government has been neglecting East London for 30 years and that the only way to attract billions of pounds of funding into the area to regenerate it was through hosting these 3 weeks of sport for the Olympics. But both of those quotes referring to the regeneration of Stratford have very, very different perspectives. And of course, different people involved in the planning and orchestration of the Olympics and the regeneration of the area in the 8 years following up to now. And this is still going on, right? It might sound like, oh, the Olympics were years ago, 8 years ago, they were finished. But the whole impact of that regeneration is still being felt today. The building of new flats, the demolition of old housing estates, lots and lots of different impacts. So if we have a look at these two images before the renovations were conducted, we can see a couple of things. So just over here on the right hand side, for your reference, hopefully you can see that there's a big train track here, and that is most of Stratford Station. Now it's been extended since then, but that's a large portion of Stratford Station. Down here you can see one of the housing estates, and in here you can see some of the sites that were cleared. I don't know if you can tell that there's a big bit of tunnel or something that's being dug under here. It looks like it's being dug. A lot of this is actually canal. Okay, so the canals that run through the Olympic Park today are actually a remnant of London's industrial past, because before we had sort of major freight transport by road through lorries, we actually used to transport coal and other materials, very heavy materials, by canal, because the boats could float large materials much more quickly and easily down those canal routes across the country. So here's some images of what the area looked like before, and here are a few of the images that we're seeing from after the regeneration. So in particular, a couple of major things, of course. This major Westfield Stratford, which is just a large shopping centre, a very large shopping centre. In fact, it's one of the largest in Europe now in an urban area. And down here we've got the Olympic Stadium. You can see all along here, although this is a night view of the Olympic Stadium, down here you can see all of this sort of lit up pathways. These are all the Olympic Park, and I don't know if you can see it quite here, where these sort of weird shaped building with wings on it. Those wings have now been removed, but that's an Olympic swimming pool, and it's just a local leisure centre now that's being used. Up here on the right, you can see a not particularly modern looking building, and that's because it's not modern at all. This is the old Stratford Centre, but you can see that they've put these sort of artistic structures up to kind of mask the ugliness of the buildings behind. So this is kind of a debate lesson. The two quotes that we've looked at, and I've asked you to answer some questions about, you just got to put a couple of thoughts down on the worksheet, show two different sides of regeneration. Some people are viewing regeneration as a positive change. They believe that it brings money, jobs, and people into an area that's been neglected and filled with poverty and deprivation. Other people view it as an unwelcome destruction of a community, the area that they have grown up in, the area that they have lived and worked in, and that maybe has been changed so much in the last couple of years that they don't recognise it anymore. So I'm going to ask you to think today about both sides of the argument using both of those quotes that we've talked about and referring to the Olympic Park in Stratford. Okay, and just a quick reminder, if you weren't very clear, regeneration is the long-term upgrading of residential, so that's places where people live, retail, where we sell things, industrial, where we make things, or commercial, other forms of business interests. So areas that are being upgraded in all of these ways. It may be people's homes, sometimes it's also shopping, sometimes it's factories, and sometimes it's just other business sort of offices and things like that. And this can happen, this regeneration, although we're currently talking about it in an urban context, this can happen in rural areas too, and that's going to be the subject of a few lessons' time. So, before we go any further, quick fire, write me a location description of Stratford. You should know this off the top of your head, but if you don't, go now, okay? So of course Stratford is over in the east of London. So Stratford is a district within the East London borough of Newham. It is north of the River Thames and in close proximity to central London. Okay, if you didn't know that, you need to know it. What I'm going to ask you to do next is a map task. Now I know we haven't done this in a while, but it's really, really helpful for you to get a sense of the area, especially because we're going to go visit it on our fieldwork. I'd like you to locate each of the regeneration projects on the next slide on this map extract of Stratford, matching each project that I tell you about to the correct number. Now, you can obviously use the map to help you out, okay? So thinking about these 5 places, I've given you the locations, you've got to match up the descriptions to these items. So let's start off with the first one, top left here, Westfield, Stratford. So if you think you can spot Westfield, Stratford on this map, let's have a little look. We know that Westfield is a large shopping centre, so it could take up quite a bit of space. And we're only looking, of course, at the 5 spots indicated by these lines. And you should hopefully have worked out that it's right next to the station, and this is Westfield, Stratford, a big shopping centre. This one, number 3, should be pretty obvious. It does say stadium, so what is this whole area that's surrounding it? If we look at this list, it is, of course, the Olympic Park. Right, let's go with those answers. Pause the video, off you go. Okay, and we're going to look at some answers. So, this regeneration then, up here in the northern part of our map, okay, we've got £10 million spent in Hackney Marshes, restoring a number of football pitches, improving the sports facilities that is in that area. And that is probably a really nice thing for the community. When you think about regeneration, the money that's going in, does anybody benefit from it in the long term is really important. So in this case, probably quite nice. The schooling is up here, okay? So just on the edge of that housing area, there's a new school which is called Chobham Academy, and it supports 1,800 pupils. Down here, as we should have been able to work out just from looking at the map, reading the stadium sign and the parky area around it, that is of course the Olympic Park. Up here I've got my numbers swapped the wrong way around, I'm sorry about that. 4 I had marked as 5 and 5 as 4, so just double check that. But of course this triangular shaped thing was Westfield Stratford, that is the shopping centre. And then East Village is a new housing area, and it does stretch beyond this bit that says Stratford New Town, actually all the way up here. And it was originally built as the athletes' village, the place where the athletes stayed during the 3 weeks of the Olympics and sort of the precursor, the training weeks and just afterwards. And then afterwards it was converted into flats, and the property was sold off as affordable homes.
So, now that we've looked at a lot of the map of Stratford and the areas and types of regeneration projects that are occurring in this area, I'm going to ask you to have a think about the impacts of regeneration. And that impact is not just on the physical landscape, the way that the built environment looks, the streets look and things like that, but also upon the people that live there. Now, we're going to ask you to watch 2 videos. You don't have to watch the entire things, you have to watch the bits that relate to our questions. But if you have the time and you think that they're interesting, and I really personally do think that they're interesting, I'd encourage you to watch the entire videos, because I think they give you a real sense of the community that we're discussing there, and in some cases, the negative impacts of this regeneration.
So, here are our 2 videos. If you're clicking through the PowerPoint, you can directly click on the videos to play them here. If you are using the worksheet, you can just click on the links that are down here to play those videos. What I'm going to ask you to do is, the first one's quite short, the second one's a bit longer. As you watch both of these videos, I want you to bullet point, please, the positive impacts and the negative impacts of regeneration that are mentioned, and put them in this table down here on your worksheet. With this second video, it is a bit longer, and it's part 1 of 4. Now, in school we would have started around 7.5 minutes in. But if you want to watch the whole thing, and my personal recommendation is that you do, then feel free to do so. And you can also catch up on parts sort of 3, 4, 5 on YouTube. The links will come up afterwards, I'm sure. Okay, so just clicking through these and then watching those videos, making some bullet points about the positive and negative impacts of regeneration that get mentioned. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do next is, using your own knowledge and the pages of the textbook, we're looking at pages 184 and 185 in the textbook, I'd like you to complete this table. So what it gives you is very specifically what sort of positive and negative impacts of 3 specific changes. So one of the things that's happened out of the regeneration of Stratford in Newham is a rising population. There's an increasing number of people coming to live in the area. It has some positive impacts and negative impacts. The environmental quality, has that been positively impacted in some ways? Is the park actually quite nice for residents? Has it improved the quality of the area? Does it look more aesthetically pleasing? Are they taking more care with the centre of town? But are there some negative impacts as well? Actually, is some of this an eyesore? Does it actually reduce the access to certain things? And economic opportunities, thinking about the types of jobs that people have available to them. Is it that there are more jobs available? Is that actually something that's happened out of this? But perhaps also thinking about the types of jobs that are available. Does everybody want to work in a shopping centre? If you're working in a shopping centre, is that high paid work? Is it high skill work? Is it that the shopping centre is going to attract other things like offices? What has really changed in this area, both positively and negatively, in terms of these 3 categories? Please pause the video now and complete the task. So let's have a look through some of these answers. They are, as always, in our PowerPoint here. So from the videos then, are quite a few positives and negatives that I wanted you to pick out. The regeneration of London, Stratford, has been in some ways an example for cities around the world. It attracted huge amounts of money, and that money means that things happen really quickly. So something that has been slowly getting better actually had a huge cash injection, and they made loads of changes very quickly. They planned for improvements in people's quality of life in the area. They were looking at it saying, okay, once the 3 weeks of sport are up for the Olympics, what are we going to use this for? This is going to be a public park. This is going to be housing. This area is going to be good for this. This area is going to be nice for the environment. This is going to be a wetland area. And they did create new homes, new leisure centres, so the swimming pool, the sort of race tracks and things. There's a velodrome, which is a biking area. There's loads of different sort of sporting facilities that are now available in Stratford that weren't there before. And the transport links that were developed and improved during that period of time to bring those thousands and thousands of spectators in now, of course, support the thousands of people who live in this area of East London. The canals were cleaned up. So in a social and environmental sense, this wasn't like a dirty, urban river anymore, but actually somewhere you might want to go and spend time. It's a nice, attractive part of the public park. You might go for a walk by the canal, and they even provide lots of cycle paths connecting this part of East London to the rest of London. And of course, Westfield bringing huge numbers of jobs, but on the flip side, not very high paid jobs, so quite low paid jobs. A lot of people who work there might have sort of part-time contracts, so this isn't a permanent job necessarily. And also, of course, the skill level, if you're thinking about how to improve an area, and particularly improving people's income levels, is working in shops always the best way to do that? Actually, would they have appreciated more office investment and opportunities to have jobs? Yes, in the tertiary sector, but perhaps in a more skilled, educated level of the tertiary sector. So in particular then, a lot of local people, and we saw this in the second video, a lot of local people felt excluded from their ideas. A lot of top-down projects, so redevelopment projects, where the government comes up with the ideas, end up leaving local people out. Their views don't get considered, and they weren't even invited to go and watch the Olympics at discounted prices. So they didn't even seem to feel as if they got any benefit from the Olympics being held there. A lot of health clinics and schools from local people weren't the priority. So, sure, they redeveloped the shopping centre and they made it look really nice for the tourists. But if you live here, the shops, they're important. But they're not as important as your local school and your local GP practice and, the other services that local people really need. So they don't feel like those things that are not so obvious but are more important for a sustainable redevelopment are being prioritised. Local people being forced out. In particular, we saw the protest on Carpenter's estate in that video, and the rent increases, have been quite phenomenal in this area. I don't know if you recall, a couple of lessons ago, we compared Richmond and Newham, and one of the things that we saw in Newham was actually that house prices in Newham, in East London, have continued to rise, even when elsewhere in London they have fallen. And then, of course, the building works themselves, hugely disruptive. So double check your answers, green pen them, fill in the gaps if you have still got gaps and you couldn't quite work out the answers. And we're going to move on. So our final task for today. I have an article for you from The Guardian, which is about the legacy of the Olympics. And when we use this word legacy, what we're saying is, what is left behind? What do people remember about the Olympics? What was the impact for the future that this big event had? And the article is interesting because it's a debate. Now, it's quite long. I just want you to read it, and I want you to figure out which 4 groups of people are mentioned. And for each of those people that are mentioned, each of those groups of people, say, for example, we might talk about local people, I want you to tell me a bit about their opinion or their perception of regeneration. Do they think it's positive or negative? Now, you might have examples where you actually have mixed opinions. Maybe some local people think both that it's positive and that it's negative, okay? And I would like you to just give me a couple of examples of each. So we're looking for bullet points here. We're not looking for, loads and loads of detail because the article is quite long to read, but I'd like you to read it because it is a really interesting set of viewpoints from so many different people. Now, one of the words that we're introducing here, and we use this quite a lot in geography, we're talking about stakeholders. And when I say stakeholder groups, I mean somebody who's got an interest or a concern about something. So if we were making changes to our school, teachers would be stakeholders, pupils and parents would be stakeholders, so would the local council or whoever was providing the money. So all of those different things, maybe the local people who might be affected by the building works, all of those different groups of people are considered stakeholders. Okay, so just as is making changes to a school might have different stakeholders, a huge regeneration project like this has lots of different stakeholders. So I'd like you to identify 4 main groups, and a little couple of brief bullet points about their opinions, positive or negatives. What are their priorities personally? We're looking at this article now. The article is attached separately. So yes, you've got your worksheet here, and the final task is for you to write down here, but the article was attached separately because it's quite long. Okay, so that is lesson 11's article there. Okay, so I'm hoping that you have read that article. I hope you found it interesting. We're going to talk about those different groups then. So these are people we've mentioned already a little bit, okay? We talked about Ken Livingstone. He was the Mayor of London at the time, and at the time of the Olympics actually occurring, the Mayor of London was Boris Johnson. There were lots of people involved in planning it, and in particularly the London Legacy Development Corporation, who we have talked about in a previous lesson when we talked about regeneration not far from Stratford in the Isle of Dogs. So still in Newham, but in another sort of Docklands area of Newham. The local people, of course, we've talked about them lots today, and we will continue to talk about local people's opinions on these things. And finally, this 4th group is the Olympic Delivery Authority. So these are the people who were put in charge, the government organisation put in charge of making the Olympics happen and making them work. For each of these guys, you should have worked out whether or not they were in support, whether they had positive opinions of the regeneration, and what their priorities were, in terms of it being maybe a success for the Olympics or having a successful longer life after the Olympics, the legacy itself, and where their priorities really lie. Guys, thank you so much for today's lesson. I'm going to leave it there. I will see you again on YouTube. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do so, because it makes a huge difference. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.